Hello. I didn't see I was on yet. Frog, we got to be we got to be serious tonight, so I'm gonna put you down. Arizona believes that they have a voting disaster that took place because we have broke the covenant that George Washington, our President George Washington, made. And let's see what this is all about. Let's go back to the history here of what took place. In April 30th, 1789, in Federal Hall in New York City, George Washington was unanimously the new nation's first president without a single dissenting vote. He got 100%. Nobody's going to ever do better than that. Wow. What can we say here? Washington, he wanted to go back to his farm and retire, but Washington again answered his call to his country. And George Washington was truly a man who did not seek power. He believed that he needed to be in service for his country. The 13 states had been apprehensive at first to ratify this Constitution. And there was only one man who could bring this all about. That man was George Washington, the only man whom they would entrust with all this power. And Washington gave the very first presidential oath of office in the first inaugural address as well. And on that April day in New York City, Washington, he followed the footsteps of other biblical characters, biblical heroes of the old that made such wonderful covenants with God: David, Solomon, Josiah. He knew God honored covenants, and he would always keep his. And that was at least keep his end of the bargain. We knew that God would keep his, and George Washington was determined to take his. The question is, would the United States of America keep hers? Robert Livingston administered the very first presidential oath of office in this new nation. He was the New York's state chancellor at the time. Washington opened a Bible, and Washington placed his left hand up on the open Bible, and Washington raised his right hand, and Washington then proceeded to take that oath of office. He said, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do my best and of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God." Washington then bent over as an act of reverence for God when he served him so many times before, and he kissed the Bible. Chancellor Livingston proclaimed, "It is done." Livingston then turned to those that were there and assembled the eyewitnesses in history and shouted, "Long live George Washington, the first president of the United States." I got a frog in my throat tonight. George Washington then went inside the Federal Hall, the Senate chamber, and he delivered the first inaugural address. And Washington opened the address with prayer. He prayed it would be perfectly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to Almighty Being, who rules the universe, who presides the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may be consecrated to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States, a government instituted themselves for these essential purposes. He continued with quite a lengthy prayer, paragraphs actually. And then Washington made a covenant with God of the universe, saying, "Since we ought to be no less persuaded that these propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained, and since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the republic, the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finely staked on the experiment entrusted in the hands of the American people. Excuse me. In his address, Washington made it clear that no nation can expect to be blessed of God, that is, the smiles of heaven, if they turn away from him, if they disregard the eternal rules and order and right. If a nation forgets God, she loses the blessing that God has given her. Representing the nation, Washington made a promise the United States of America would follow God. If she would never broke her promise, then she would lose. If she ever were to break her promise, she would lose God's blessing and protection. God would keep his promise. He always keeps his promises. Only one question remained: would the United States of America keep hers? This covenant with God is a two-way covenant. It's a promise, a condition which is set by God. And when we enter in a covenant with God, we promise to keep those conditions. And then he promises certain blessings in return. Now, God holds everyone to their sacred covenants. To break them with God is to bring a curse. And to those who do not keep their covenants. Covenants were passed from generation to generation, and our nation has passed it down from generation to generation to keep it. But we have not kept God's promises. We have not kept that covenant, and we have received a curse. And this is what Arizona was trying to tell us, that we have not kept the covenant that God gave God, and therefore that's why we had the disaster, not only in Arizona, they said, but all across our nation of ours. We as a nation must go back. They claim to follow God, to bring back the covenant that George Washington had given. And if we're ever going to give all the blessings that God wants us to have, I just hope I'm still on, because I've lost the background here completely. Anyhow, basically, God gives a blessing when we do good and keep our covenant with him, if we ever do that, and a curse when we don't. In fact, similar to this, it says in Deuteronomy 11:28, 26 to 28, see, I have set it before you today, a blessing and a curse. And the blessing, if you obey the commands of the Lord your God, that I give you today, and a curse if you disobey the commands of the Lord your God I'm giving you today. The curse if you disobey the commands of the Lord, and a blessing if you do keep the commands. It's up to us. A patriot, friends, I lost the picture, so I don't know where I'm at here, but the covenant, hopefully I'm still on, the covenants is up to us. The vows of what we take are up to us. We're serving a covenant God, and we need to obey him. And we need to obey him in America to bring back the blessing that God truly wants to bring. God bless you all. Thanks for listening. Thumbs up if you appreciate this, because it's very, very important. I appreciate all of you. Love you. God bless you, and good evening. Now, if I can see the picture, we're to turn it off because I've lost it completely.